on a completely different level when duly elected elected leaders do it. Take St. Louis Mayor Lyda Krewson, who was forced to apologize hours after reading the names and the addresses of people who wrote to her office about defunding the police. It happened during the mayor's Facebook Live briefing yesterday. Take a listen.
Here's one that wants $50 million to go to cure violence, $75 million to go to affordable housing, $60 million to go to health and human services, and have zero go to the police. So that's on who is living no police, no money going to police. Here's somebody, I think it is, wants all the money to go to cure violence, affordable housing, human services, nothing to go to police. That address is on.
The audacity of her constituents to demand real reform. Joining me now, Sheriff Rochelle Bilal of Philadelphia County, Pennsylvania. Philip Atiba Goff, co-founder and CEO of the Center for Policing Equity. Brittany Packnett Cunningham, MSNBC contributor, and she was a member of President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force. And Paul Butler, MSNBC legal analyst, former federal prosecutor, and author of Chokehold, Policing Black Men. I'm going to go to you first, Brittany, on this. The St. Louis mayor issued a statement after reading the names and addresses of constituents. And she said, while this is public information, I did not intend to cause distress or harm to anyone. I'm wondering how you could not intend to cause distress or harm to anyone by reading out people's addresses, telling people where people live, and then reading out, where they wanted money to go to instead of police. You're the only reason I know about this. You alerted me to this story, so I wanted to get your reaction to her statement.
Well, as a native St. Louisan, unfortunately, this is par for the course for what folks in my city experience. Look, Mayor Lyda Krewson has been an elected official in the city of St. Louis for 23 years. She very well knows the difference between a sunshine request, which requires forms and fees and a process, and wantonly and openly reading the names, identifying information, and addresses of the citizens that she is sworn to protect. Imagine the message of permission that is going to a police department that continues to kill people with impunity, that continues to harm peaceful protesters, and against a backdrop of the continued stalking and harming over the last 6 years since the Ferguson uprising of those very protesters and organizers. Those folks are getting a very clear permission slip to not only continue that intimidation, but to move forward. Local activists and leaders are very clearly calling for her resignation because there needs to be a clear punishment for wantonly and recklessly endangering your very citizens. And so that resignation needs to happen urgently and immediately. They are very, very clear that a social media apology won't do because the harm is already done.
It is pretty remarkable, but it shows you, Philip, the fusion between a lot of elected officials who run on this tough on crime mantra and the police. And the fusion is hard to break, as hard as it is to break between police and prosecutors, which is why so few of them ever get prosecuted for anything, even if they kill someone. You now have a change, at least an attempt to break that cycle in Minneapolis. The Minneapolis City Council is now moving to, in fact, defund police. So sorry to that mayor. Sorry to this woman, but some people are actually moving to start to defund police. To defund the police and establish a holistic public safety force. Just to read a little bit of this article. Under the proposed plan, the city would eliminate the existing police department and replace it with a Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention, which will have responsibility for public safety services, prioritizing a holistic public health-oriented approach. The department would be overseen by a director nominated by the mayor and approved by the city council. Only individuals with non-law enforcement experience in community safety services, including but not limited to public health and restorative justice approaches, will be eligible to hold the post, according to this amendment. Philip, is this a model for what could be done? Because listen, there is a defund the police movement. There's also an abolition of police movement that's out there that needs to be addressed and discussed. There are people who are saying, just replace this whole system with something like what Minneapolis is getting. What do you make of it?
Yeah, what's happening in Minneapolis is genuinely unprecedented. I have no idea whether or not it's going to be a model because they haven't finished with it yet. But what that what that vote did was it took exclusive authority over appointing a police chief away from the mayor, put it in the hands of the city council, and the city council made really clear what their values were. It's saying this system that is unbroken from the time when law enforcement was brought in to engage with runaway slaves, when law enforcement was brought in to make sure that people stayed in their homes and got home by sundown, that system needs to be broken down and rebuilt up again. Now, the question is going to be, how is it rebuilt? Because these are really bold actions, again, unprecedented, but I can't say loudly enough, we can't look away right now. Imagine what it would have looked like in St. Louis if we hadn't had the last 6 weeks. Because these sorts of statements they're not anomalies, right? Brittany was talking about this is 23 years of service for this particular woman, who we say sorry to. But this is happening in Parks and Recs-like theaters all over the country, where there is lockstep between the most brutal actions of the state and the elected officials of the state. If we look away right now, we're going to go right back to it, and we're going to have these really well-intentioned new rules and regulations. They can go left really fast, where you have a new name on the exact same kind of viciousness and unaccountability to the public. So I'm hoping, but really I'm exhorting the public. Right now is the time when it's rare for a show like this to have this at the very top, where this is the most important issue. So thank you, Joy, for putting it on. But we can't look away,
of course,
because the most common thing at the end of these cycles, it's not the beginning where there's violence from law enforcement. It's not the middle where, government sort of decides it wants to get involved. It's the end where we collectively decide to forget, except for the folks who live in the communities, from someone who they've lost.
Yeah, and and I think about Eric Garner. I Can't Breathe was the thing that we heard 6 years ago with Eric Garner, and there were huge marches, and there was a huge upheaval, and then nothing. I mean, this is actually revolutionary that we're seeing within 1 month of George Floyd's also I Can't Breathe death. We have actual legislation on the floor. Now, we don't know what Mitch McConnell's going to do with it, but at least in the House, they've passed something substantial. But I want to go get the police chief involved here, because I want to just go through a few headlines that we've seen, and this is just Aurora officers involved in Elijah McLane's August 2019 arrest. They've now been reassigned. This is 1 year after this young man who was 23 years old was killed. And that was done according to, this is the Denver Post, I believe. That was done to protect the officers, according to Detective Faith Goodrich, a spokesman for the Aurora Police Department. So the officers are pulled off for their own protection. You have a Denver Post article from November of 2019. District Attorney Dave Young declined to file any charges against the Aurora officers in the death of Elijah McLane. Young, in a letter dated Friday to Aurora Police, Nick Metz said, from the officer's perception, it went from an investigatory stop to a potential life-threatening incident, and it certainly raised the officer's use of force. Under the circumstances of this investigation, it's improbable for the prosecutors to prove a cause of death beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury. Consequently, the evidence does not support prosecution. Let's get another one. NYPD officer charged with strangulation after putting a man in an apparent chokehold. Officer David Afendor was suspended without pay after video showed him putting a man named Ricky Bellevue in an apparent chokehold, a banned maneuver. We have a Tucson police chief saying he's willing to resign over the handling of another man's death while in custody. It just goes on and on and on and on. And I'm sorry to make you have to speak for the entire profession, Sheriff Bilal, but this isn't changing when protests are starting. What we're seeing when protests are starting is officers acting up more. We see what those officers said in North Carolina, that they're angry that they have to be scrutinized, that they're angry that there are protests, that they're angry that some police have sympathy for the dead. You're seeing people bring up cases from years earlier where people are being choked and choked and choked and choked all over this country, and it's disproportionately black people and brown people and indigenous people. For a lot of people, Sheriff, a lot of people believe that the police system cannot be fixed, that it is so broken and it is so full of people who just really are either afraid of, naturally afraid of, or just cannot stand black and brown people, that it has to be scrapped. From a law enforcement point of view, you have to deal with some of these people who you have to work with and you can't fire. Do you understand why a lot of people say scrap the whole thing?
First of all, thank you very much for having this format. And I love everybody that's on this panel because you are right on the mark. Some of these departments do need to be scrapped. Some of them. You need to look at them and see what they have been doing in the past and scrap them. And all of this is coming out because it needs to come out. I've been in law enforcement, a police officer for 27 years. I'm now the sheriff of the county of Philadelphia. These incidents are not new. Our black civic organizations have been speaking out against these issues for a long time. Guardian Civic League started in 1956, a black officers coming together because of how people were treating our community and us. You have Black Cops Against Police Brutality under Dr. Davis. He has formed these organizations to fight against these institutions, and these organizations did just not start today. We've been screaming about this forever. We're like, yes, now everybody sees what we've been seeing inside. This is a fight that has to continue. We are for the struggle. We are for these protesters. Come out. Some needs to be changed in these institutions, and we're going to make sure. But here's what we need to also look at, and some people are missing this. We had officers speaking out against these issues a long time ago, and yet they were fired. Just give you one for one. Carol Horn in Buffalo. She did the same thing that you are asking cops to do today. Stop them from kneeling on our neck or choking us. She did that. She was fired. She is devastated. She was 19 years, lost her pension, devastated to the point she was living in a shelter. These are the people that you have to come out and support, because if our departments are consisting more of other folks than us, and then some of us do some of this mess too. Let me not stop that. Some of us play into this game. But if these institutions don't help support those who step up and speak out, my life was threatened in Philadelphia when I was the president of the Guardian Civic League, shut down Dome Lights, which Dome Lights was a website that white cops was on there talking about black people in such a negative way, even talking about babies, wanted to go to a swim class. Oh, we're going to get her outside her house so she could be raped outside an AIDS clinic. Threatened. And so if you don't help support those that step up and speak out, help them. I'm saying today, Caroline Horn lives off a GoFundMe. If you are about change, and if those talking about they are about don't like racism and they anti-racism, then support the ones that step up and speak out on these issues. I'm saying let's go.
Yeah,
do the work.
Absolutely. And Paul, you know, we talk about this all the time. I feel like we talk about this, you know, every week. But I remember a case in Baltimore where, and this was a white officer who spoke out against the abuse of black people in that community, and he had to leave Baltimore. He had to go and change cities and move because he was so harassed because he spoke out. There's a culture inside of policing. There's the actual work of policing, and then there's the culture of it. And the culture of it says don't speak out against everyone else. If I file a report that says it went this way, you all agree with me. You know, you saw a black officer in the case of Walter Scott in South Carolina agree with the report that was filed by the killer of Walter Scott, who knew what he'd done, that he dropped a taser to make Walter Scott look like a criminal. And he's now in prison, but only because the feds came and got him. Because a jury hung because the woman who actually went to prosecute him, she gave a soft case that blamed Walter Scott for his own death. So that collusion happened there too. So it's difficult to break this culture. And so I think that's why a lot of people have moved past. They've said, yeah, defund these organizations or maybe just scrap them and start again.
With dysfunctional police departments, there's two sets of rules. So one set is what you learn in the police academy, what rookies are taught about the Constitution and their duty to be accountable, their duty to serve and protect. And then there's another set, the law of the streets, what rookies are taught when experienced officers take them on patrols and say, this is how it really works. And with dysfunctional police departments, how it really works is chokeholds. Even when they're banned, sometimes you got to do what you have to do, especially if the suspect is black or Hispanic. And the suspect is always black or Hispanic in too many of these jurisdictions. The sheriff is completely right that oftentimes minority law enforcement officers will have very different positions, both on policy issues and sometimes, but not always, on how they treat folks in the street. The problem is the police leadership tends to be represented by these unions that are controlled by older white officers, almost exclusively male, who aren't down with modern day policing in diverse communities. These are old school officers who, again, they're just not on board with the change and transformation that's necessary in this moment.
Yeah, and the public, including black and brown and indigenous people who are being abused, are paying for that lack of service. The officer who killed George Floyd could collect $1 million in pension, even if he's convicted. We're paying for this abuse, and that is the thing that's the problem. I wish we had more time. Sheriff Rochelle Bilal, thank you so much. Philip Atiba Goff, Brittany Patton Cunningham, thank you very much. Paul will be back in our next hour.